The V10 era. The inaugural season of the V10 era was reminiscent of the 1988 season in that just two teams won every single Grand Prix. But at least this time around, there's a little bit more balance, with the eventual champion taking 10 wins for Ferrari, and McLaren would take 7 wins. And when you step back and think about it, the 3-liter V10 era had all the potential of solid racing, at least at the top of the grid. I'm of the opinion that Ferrari's reign in the early 2000s is a little bit misunderstood. One could argue that BMW had a more powerful engine, and that's what's so surprising. It's not even really controversial. And once they lost Newey, they yet again formed another relationship with the power supplier that they were very dependent on, as the chassis left much to be desired. And the 2003 season was truly special. It was the peak of the era. Williams and McLaren would hit their stride finally. The teams, led by the young talents of JPM and Raikkonen, were actually keeping pace with Schumacher, relatively speaking. They'd both also notched their first wins of their career. But it's a remarkably tall order to ask them to compete with a driver who was on the verge of breaking El Maestro's nearly half-century-old World Driver Championship record at 5 titles. While 11 points separated 3 drivers, the details reveal a young Raikkonen with scary inconsistency was almost Schumacher's undoing, despite winning 5 more races than the Finn. The 3 retirements for JPM and Kimi would be the major headwinds to their ability to challenge. But this was as close as really anyone got in this era. You never really felt that anyone got the drop on Ferrari, a team that was sound not just in the driver and car, but also their personnel. And of course everyone knows of the Dream Team, but this would extend far beyond that, as some of the most iconic names in motorsport would all fall under the Maranello umbrella during this reign. And I think I've identified that precise moment that was the unraveling for both of these teams. Midway through this era, the technical regulations would shift to ban both automatic gearboxes and launch control. With the regulations exposing the cars more and more to the bare bones of what they really were, the desperation to find some way to uproot Ferrari's dominance led to some overzealous designs by both of the previous year challengers. Here's a couple examples of what I'm talking about. For Williams, the problem was the walrus nose. This massively disappointing gamble on the FW26 would mean a crushing defeat in a season that could have easily went the way of Williams. And as for McLaren, the MP4-18 was their downfall. The beating Schumacher put on the field in 2002 led to Ron Dennis searching for innovation. The design that came out of this era witch hunt was the horror show of the MP4-18, a car so bad, one that failed crash tests and out-of-control cooling problems, the team shelved the design. Having figured it wasn't good enough for 2003, McLaren decided to develop the 18 for 2004. What could go wrong? Everything. That's what. Everything. Building on the 18's principles, the MP4-19 never finished above P5, and it was in the points 39% of the time. And by France, the team decided to throw the towel in on the design. And with the old car scrapped, an entirely new car was made, the MP4-19B, and it would be responsible for 75% of McLaren's entire season total. Kimi notched 4 podiums and a win even. The history books will unanimously depict a clinical performance by Schumacher, winning a baker's dozen races, matched only by Vettel's impressive 2013. And what's more, the F2004 retired a grand total of 2 races, neither of which were mechanical. But Kimi's run, especially there at the end of 2004, would prove to be no fluke. He and rising Renault superstar Fernando Alonso would leave the grizzly old vet behind the following campaign. And while technically still a part of the era, 2005 would feel like an entirely new season. But the FIA's fingerprints would be all over this one, with a very bizarre rule that would ban tire changes throughout the season. This change, along with a few others, would give rise to a new champion in Fernando Alonso, and this would break a stretch of time where Ferrari looked untouchable. Over the course of the V10 era, Ferrari were responsible for 67.1% of wins, 68.8% of podiums, and 58.8% of pole positions. The Michaels' dominance over this time period was emphatic, and it speaks to the power of having institutional knowledge of a race team carry over. Now, it must also be stated that both of the challenging teams made some strategic and technical decisions they'd soon like to forget ever happened. That in no ways aimed to dilute what Ferrari did, but it would be irresponsible not to call out the crucial errors from the likes of Williams and McLaren. But 2006 was yet another change in F1. Thankfully, the tire change rule made its exit, but more importantly, after 6 seasons with the mandated V10 engines, further engine changes were on the horizon for the grid. The V8 era. Renault would take a page from Ferrari's book and begin a run of their own that would be cut short by Alonso's move to work for Ron Dennis in 2007. Given how extensively I've covered the transition from the V8 to the V10 era, I'll spare you another retelling. The rest of the V8 era was under a freeze to accommodate waning outlooks on the viability of the sport. The FIA cleverly dubbed this engine homologation. It would begin in the penultimate round of 2006 and all the way through into the implementation of KERS. Additionally, a 19,000 rev limit was put into place. The diversity of power on the grid was astonishing, with at least 5 different engines powering at least 10 different teams throughout the entirety of the era. And this alone would give way to riveting championship battles that went down to the wire. But it would also be the source of a very top-heavy Constructors' Championship. Keep in mind, the points allocation is still 10 through 1 point awarded for the top 8 finishers. The 2007 season also ushered in the banning of traction control, another moving part of the story that disproportionately affects the slower end of the field. It also saw the tire supplier market shrink to just one. While not the flashiest of titles, Ferrari did take 2 of the contested 3 championships as a team this era, with their only loss notched in the closest Constructors' Championship in the history of the sport, as measured by percent change in points. The Kurz era. The global financial crisis led to the withdrawal of BMW and Toyota, but ushered in the return of the Cosworth engine. But a return to slick tires as well as the introduction of the Kurz system would massively shake up the grid. Engines were also further tuned down to max out at 18,000 revs. The new Braun GP team had adapted best to these new stringent regulations, and proof of this would be Button racking up more than double the points of the next nearest car that wasn't his teammate. And while the season did feel a bit like a one-off, it was an incredible season to watch nonetheless, and to this day is still one of my favorite season reviews. Another change to the point system would have an impact on the allocated spread and the subsequent championship margins, which can be seen today with the awarded amounts ranging from 25 for a win to 1 point for a P10. And the rest of the year was all Red Bull. But I've been informed that winning 4 straight titles isn't that dominant. The comment section of the 2010 and 12 season reviews is full of good conversation about the definition of dominance and what made these seasons so special. But I'll let you be the judge of that. The fact remains that despite the other team's best efforts, Red Bull took each attack in stride and did enough to win in changing circumstances with a car that was either blessed by the racing gods or cursed, depending on which season you're talking about. And while Sebastian Vettel drove phenomenally in 2013, I'm required to make one caveat to this. As per the standard arrangement, depending on how large the FIA overhaul of the impending regulations is about to be, teams will abandon the current era regulation just to prepare for the next. Most teams were now gearing up for their challengers to be fitted with the latest turbo hybrid era technology that would begin in 2014. But one team above them all was more prepared than any, and it just so happened that they had the help from someone who got it right in the last era change as well. I guess a few era changes technically. The turbo hybrid era. The final agreed upon engine shift would have massive implications across the grid, and it went through different variations. Originally, it was proposed that the inline 4-cylinder engine would be the headline of the era, but some teams would voice their concern about this, and they would cite lessons from the past as the way forward. Remember I told you to remember that moment from back in the 60s? And I told you we'd talk about this again. You know, that one guy, Colin Chapman. Well, as it turns out, Adrian Newey would dust off technologies that were far ahead of its time clearly, citing technical advancements over 40 years old from Chapman's Lotus 49. Here's what that sounded like.
Well, the initial decision from the engine working group was for a 4-cylinder turbo to be introduced for 2013, and that's what everybody agreed in order to get Audi in. They subsequently decided that no, they wouldn't bother after all, thank you very much. And we were all lumbered with a 4-cylinder turbo. Certainly from an engineering point of view, the 4-cylinder turbo is not a nice car to install. A racing V6 is a much nicer engine to package. That will now be the 2014 engine.
And the regulatory body listened to this criticism, and they spat out what we have today. And many people will often go on about how the car sounds, as if that changes anything, but as a vocal critic of the fuel flow implementations and how they're controlled, I speculate this has to be a major cause of the depressed RPM count. And this, coupled with the use of turbochargers, created the more tame-sounding car we see on track today. But the V6 1.6-liter turbo engine was adopted, and the rest is history. And if you've been under a rock or in a coma, Mercedes has taken 7 straight Constructors' Championship in an era of 7 consecutive years of mostly unchanged regulations. And while the turbo hybrid era has been an impressive display of winning from the Aeros, there have been the very few moments where they didn't feel totally in control. The 2017 season is the example that jumps out, as it's the most interesting technically and politically, but also simply because Sebastian Vettel led a majority of that season, with Ferrari looking like they were the favorites through Monaco. But as suggested, those instances are very short-lived. Mercedes has taken 79% of poles and won 73.9% of races throughout this era. I've already performed a numbers-based exploration comparing the most dominant F1 stretches, where I covered just how dominant Mercedes has been if you're into that sort of thing. But to the uninitiated, here's a 10,000-foot view of what the past 7 years has really looked like. On aggregate, the Aeros would take 4,804 points of the 5,951 available to them, and this calculates to an 80.73% of maximum available points seized upon. With respect to how other constructors have performed across eras, this is astounding, and yes, this does account for the point system changing over time. Now, having said all that, it's no surprise that I've concluded in the past that the turbo hybrid era has been one of the most lopsided of all of F1 racing. Now let's return to the question from the beginning of this video. How many teams have held the clear advantage all the way through the era the way that Mercedes has in the current era? Now that we've essentially gone through the entire history of the sport, looking at the major technical changes, you should have a better sense of what this is. So what is the answer? I'd say twice if we're generous and once if we're honest. Note the proximity of both the V10 and the KERS era to the current turbo hybrid era. This serves as proof. As technology evolves, so too does the team's ability to cement certain advantages over the grid. I waffled back and forth between one or two instances of a team dominating throughout the full era simply because in Schumacher's era, the BMW was the most powerful engine. I'm even hesitant to go along with KERS simply because while yes, Red Bull did win all four, and while yes, I do think that's domination, make no mistake about it, the turbo hybrid era is one that's dominated by the power unit advantage. So throughout this video, hopefully you picked up on a few main trends, but let's lay some out right now and look how that lays over top of the turbo hybrid era. The first trend is when a team enters the era, they are likely not going to be the team that is dominating by the end of the era. It's very rare. And trend number 2, that's just a reversal of trend number 1. The team that actually ends the era, it's likely changing because of something they've unveiled. Not always, but again, speaking in terms of generalities here, that's likely the case. And the final trend, which in my opinion is one of the most important, if not the, how many of these eras lasted more than 5 to 6 years? Aside from very early on in the regulations when Formula 1 could barely get enough cars to finish a race, let alone be competitive. Major regs changes, they were pretty common. And this is particularly true if there's a clear team that's just out and away dominant. And again, with respect to modern racing, the longer that the era is going to drag on, the longer that the dominant team is going to exploit their advantage. And in today's racing, where the customer model is not only viable, it's attractive. The gap to the top teams is as rigid as it is wide. The only time things change up is because of force hand by the FIA, case in point, Ferrari's power unit in 2019. So as the sport continues to try to progress in the face of not just out of control marketing power, but also the high cost of development, they're going to have to make some concessions. And those decisions are going to be incredibly important. The only hope for any kind of shakeup is if a driver leaves. Hamilton must retire for us to see anything different. Just take a look at one of the closest Constructors' Championships of this entire era. Hamilton won nearly double the races as Ferrari combined. What is the definition of insanity, as the saying goes? And I'm not expecting change to be perfect. It's definitely not always the case, and not in this sport. But it does give the teams and their geniuses on the technical side some breathing room to work their magic.
P0 first and jump out.
Yeah, bring back the V12.
So that's what Seb meant, right? I doubt it. He probably just longed for a time that better embodied the spirit of Enzo, a love for the powerful engine. Simply put, a louder time, a simpler time. Well, let me throw it back to you. What do you think the problem, if anything, with modern racing is? How would you break down the different eras? And let's keep it simple. What was your favorite era? But thanks for your time and being here. It means a lot to me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you very, very soon.